Welcome to Rise to Lead, the podcast where heart-driven leaders come together to inspire and innovate. They will share actionable tips and insights that help you lead your team more successfully, advance your career or business as a leader, achieve greater impact, and experience deeper fulfillment. I'm your host, Regina Huber, guiding you through deep conversations about leadership that's rooted in service, freedom, and the desire to leave a positive mark on the world. Welcome to today's episode of Rise to Lead. I'm super thrilled to introduce our guest, the leadership futurist, Zoë Routh. Don't you love that? I totally love that title. Welcome to the show, Zoë.
Oh, Regina, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes, and I'm excited too. Allow me to introduce you in more detail before we go into our discussion, okay, or conversation. Zoë Routh is a leadership futurist, podcaster, and multiple award-winning author. She works with leaders and teams to explore what's coming and what it means for leadership of the future. She has worked with individuals and teams internationally and in Australia since 1987. From wild Canadian rivers to the Australian outback and the boardroom jungles, Zoë is an adventurist. She facilitates strategy and culture for the future with audacious teams. Zoë's fourth leadership book, People Stuff Beyond Personality Problems, an advanced handbook for leadership, won the Book of the Year at the Australian Business Book Awards in 2020. Congratulations. Her fifth book is a leadership futurist science fiction dystopian novel, The Olympus Project, and it won a gold medal at the Reader's Favorites Awards in 2023. Zoë is the producer of the Zoë Routh Leadership Podcast, dedicated to asking what if and sharing big ideas on the future of leadership. And I'm honored to have been a guest on her podcast as well. Zoë, we have so many things in common, and yet we're so unique at the same time. Isn't that always amazing? It's something that always amazes me. For example, we both love adventure. I'm currently writing a book about my adventures and the leadership lessons as well that I learned through those adventures. And we both dance or danced. I see that also in your resume and in your bio, sorry. And I'm gonna of course post the complete bio in the description as well. And we both apparently love what if questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wrote about those in my first book. What if questions are all about opening up possibilities, aren't they? So I use the what if questions a little bit differently in my book than you're doing it in a different context, but it's still the same concept. Opening up possibilities. Is that what you also want to do with what if questions?
Absolutely. So as a leadership futurist, I'm always exploring the future and asking, what if this happened? What if that happened? And sometimes you go down a dystopian track with that, and sometimes it's a utopian track with that. Those are more fun. And yet it helps us to imagine the future better so we can lead better now.
Absolutely. Yes. So let's get the conversation started, shall we, Zoë?
I'm into it. Let's go.
Okay, great. In just a few sentences, tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you work with your clients.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I am a leadership futurist, leadership expert. I love to work with strategy and culture with adventurous CEOs and their executives. How I got there was started in adventure, as you alluded to. So in Canada, where I grew up, I led wonderful canoe trip expeditions over 3 and 6 weeks with young people. And that was my first foray into working with teams in difficult circumstances and working on my own personal leadership skills as well as team leadership skills. And that brought me to Australia here, where I worked for Outward Bound for 9 years, doing similar leadership development in very difficult circumstances in rough terrain, doing fabulous outdoor activities. And then I worked for the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation, where it was more of the same, with the addition of doing the adventures in the boardroom and doing on the ground contextual leadership, not only as a metaphor in the outdoors, but as real leadership on the ground in complex situations across agriculture and all sorts of rural sectors. So that's a little bit of my background. That's why I have a Canadian accent, though I'm in Australia. And the work I love to do these days is really working on strategy and culture with senior leadership teams.
Wow, yeah, that's impressive. And I'm from a farm. Did you know that? So
I
agriculture.
did not know that. Just add that to the tally of things we have in common.
Yeah, see, we can add that to the list. You work in agriculture. I'm from a small farm in southern Bavaria, near the Alps. Not too far
Beautiful.
actually from, it's southeastern Bavaria, I should say. It's not too far from the Austrian border. Yeah, so that is super exciting. A very unique path and a very unique type of experience, I would say.
I guess so. Everybody has a unique experience, but I guess not everybody paddles weeks at a time across the Canadian Shield. So, yep, that's pretty unique. I've had an adventurous life, that's for sure, and I continue to undertake adventures. In fact, in April, I did a 2-week bushwalk on the Australian Alpine walking track with some of my friends who are ex-outward bounders as well. So it's really stayed with me. It's been a mainstay of my life to go out exploring, which I think is one of the reasons why I'm well positioned as a futurist, because that's the art of adventuring into the future, is trying to see what's around the next bend, what's over the next hill, what's on the horizon. And that curiosity, I think, is something that needs to be harnessed amongst people if they are going to lead better. And it's something that have naturally come across and love to share with others, that sort of adventuring spirit in the journey of leadership.
I so love your story, Zoe. Really, I am also insatiably curious. I think that's what pushed me out into the world as well. So we have another thing in common. At the same time, I think that curiosity is an essential leadership trait. So we're not talking this invasive type of curiosity, of course, but the healthy curiosity, finding out about people, what they're all about, finding out about their talents beyond job descriptions and this type of thing, right?
Absolutely. I think that's hilarious. You call it invasive curiosity. I've never heard that before. It's a kind of a euphemism for being nosy.
Exactly. So that's not what I mean, though. So there's, in
No.
my mind, there are two types of curiosity. There are probably more types of curiosity, but the two opposing types are the invasive one, which maybe asks too many questions that are not appropriate, and then there's the
Sure.
healthy curiosity that is all about asking the right questions, right? Yeah.
We're asking
Okay.
non-invasive ones anyway.
Okay. Well, tell us why you're passionate about heart-centered leadership and what your definition of that is, if you had to give a definition.
I'll lift my definition from one of my mentors, Cindy Wigglesworth, who wrote SQ21, the 21 Skills of Spiritual Intelligence, which is an advanced emotional intelligence handbook. And in her work, she is central to advancing wisdom and compassion. And she believes that one without the other is like a bird with one wing. You need both in order to be effective. And being a wise and compassionate leader means leading with the best of the heart, that's your compassion, and best of the mind, and that's your wisdom. And we need to balance both so that we can make sensitive and sensible decisions. And why I'm passionate about that is because I think it's only in that way that we are able to navigate complexity, and we find ourselves mired in uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, volatility, the old VUCA acronym there. And to find our way through, we need to be balanced. We can't just think our way through it. That's got some limitations. And we can't just feel our way through it, because that brings on some blind spots. So creating heart, as you call it, heart-centered leadership, I feel it encompasses both the wisdom and compassion piece. And in doing that, we elevate the people around us, because when we connect with others and we have a broad view of who our stakeholders are, who our shareholders are, then it allows us to make decisions that have long-standing ripple effects for multi-generations. And that's the kind of leadership that wakes me up and gets me going in the morning. So leaders who are thinking multi-generations into the future and are considering issues well into the past so they can make the best decisions possible. Because I believe with better leaders, we have a better world, and heart-centered leadership, or wise and compassionate leadership, is the way that we're going to steer our way through the fog that is ahead of us.
Absolutely. I so agree. With better leaders, we have a better world. This is actually also one of the reasons why I started this podcast in the first place, to share the wisdom of people like you and other guests, and really inspire other leaders or leaders to be, to step up and be, you use the word audacious, I use the word bold a lot, and I really love when heart-centered leaders do that, and they find the courage, which is also in our hearts. We find our courage in our hearts. And as you said, part of the wisdom is in the head brain and the mind. However, there's also wisdom in our hearts, which is very unique to us, which is that intuitive wisdom, which is also related to our experiences. And it's a very complex topic, right? The heart wisdom, everything we find in our hearts that has been so underrated and neglected because we're so head focused in our societies. And I think that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on this topic with this podcast specifically. So you mentioned something else before, sorry, that I wanted to quickly expand on, because curiosity is also leads to visionary leadership. Would you agree?
Not all the time, and yet it is a precursor to being visionary. So it's hard to be visionary if you're not curious, I think, is probably a good way of framing that, because to be curious means to be asking questions, is to be open to new ideas, new perspectives. And in doing so, that's how we might see new ways of being, doing, and experiencing, and new places and visions to create. So I think you're right. It is a precursor to being visionary, but I think you can be curious without being visionary. I mean, there's a case for people just asking questions and soaking things all up. The brilliance in terms of moving from curiosity to visionary is to make sense of all that. So being curious absolutely is the first step. So being humble and curious enough to be open and asking those questions about what's going on, what's happening, how might we do this, and then knitting it all together. Weaving it all together takes craftsmanship, and that's the visionary component of it. It's how can we bring all these often disparate strands together to weave something unique and new. And that's where curiosity added to creativity, added to compassion, those three elements can start to create a visionary leader or visionary leadership. So I think there's a couple of steps that are involved in it, but curiosity is definitely a good starting place.
Yes, I also really like that you mentioned compassion so much. I wrote an article once which was called The New Business Consciousness of Love, Compassion, and Co-Creation. So I'm a big fan of compassion as well. Totally. I think it's so key. Now, talking about visions, right? I'm an idealist, at least to a certain extent, because idealistic visions may not always take us all the way to our ideal or to our ideal reality, but they can take us considerably closer to it. That's at least what I believe. So the future of leadership, what's your vision of that, Zoe? What does that ideally look like to you? If you had a magic wand.
We've been talking about some of the elements involved in what I believe is the future of leadership. And compassion is one element of it. Creativity is another. And the third piece, which you call co-creation, I call collaboration. Those are the three essential skills and attributes I believe that we need in order to navigate the future. They're kind of how we will trim our sails as we go along through the rough seas of what's coming. And those three elements, I think, are essential to it. Now, we can build around that all the perennial aspects of leadership that aren't going away. Things like ethical decision-making, things like effective management and stewardship. things like effective communication and problem solving and decision making. All those core tenets of leadership are still along for the ride. We don't throw any of that out. And yet compassion, collaboration, and creativity are the three things that are going to dial in together to help us create new visions of what's possible, new pathways to troubleshoot some of the technologies and intersections of technologies and societies that are coming together to create new challenges for us. So just as we solve some problems, other problems will arise. And I think that constant curiosity, creativity, connectivity, compassion, collaboration is how we're going to do that. So the future of leadership is really essentially collaborative. I don't think there is this idea that one person can encompass it all. The world is far too complex, and we need each other in order to weave the tapestry together.
That is so well said. Really, really, really love this. You talked about ethical leadership as well, and ethical decision-making in particular. And this is something that I personally believe that there's a lack of in our world today. It also includes, in my understanding, making decisions that might not be the popular ones right away, or making decisions that go against the mainstream at times when we know that it might be difficult, but we still, because of our ethical inner being, we still need to make that decision in that way. And that's not always an easy thing to do, because we run up against barriers, we run up against opposition, but it's a very necessary thing to do. I believe that, that's also why I talk a lot about courageous leadership, because that's what we really need more of in the world, in my understanding. What do you think about that?
We need courageous leadership, absolutely. We need it in association with making ethical decisions, absolutely. And when we're talking about ethical leadership, and it's not a black and white issue, is it? That's why we have the study of ethics. What ought one to do, and why is it troublesome? Often because we have competing values, and we have to decide which value supersedes the other, and what is lost if we make this decision versus what is gained. And it's not even just a pros and cons kind of equal equation there. It's really challenging. And sometimes the courage part is associated with, I need to make this decision even though it's a personal cost, or I need to make this decision even though it's a cost to the people I care about. I need to make this decision even though other people will be hurt by it. So it's often very difficult to make these fraught decisions, and leaders are often troubled by that, because most of us want to do a good job. Most of us want to be esteemed and valued and appreciated. Most of us want to be liked. And so these personal concerns can often steer us in the wrong direction. And for people who are unethical, who make decisions only to benefit themselves, despite the pain it causes others, that's, I think, where things are troublesome. And the other thing that's troublesome is when we assume that our ethics are the same as others, or others should have the ethics that we have. And that is not always the case. And I think this polarization issue that we see across many communities is related to that. We've lost our ability to swim in the gray seas of where our ethics might overlap and where our values might overlap and where they differ. And finding that common ground and our common humanity is what we need to come back to. So coming back to heart-centered leadership, that's where we need to come back to it, so that we can sit across the table or side by side with someone who has a different opinion about how we might proceed, and yet we can find where we believe we have the same things. Otherwise, we demonize others, we create rifts, and then that can lead to all sorts of dysfunctions in businesses, in communities, and indeed in nations. And so that is the dystopian problem with not being able to master ethical decision making. I'm not sure that anybody actually truly masters it. But if leaders can bring ethical considerations into their decision making and really process their options through the lens of what ought one to do, what are my values that are informing this, and considering the ripple effect across the decisions, then we're a step forward in terms of being able to make more tempered, sensitive, and sensible decisions. And that gives me some hope if we can manage to do that. And I think we need to talk about more around this ethical decision making, where we get it, where we veer on the path or where we stay on the path.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Ethics and integrity, they can look different for different people. We talk so much about ethics and integrity, but we oftentimes forget that they are not the same for everybody. They look different to different people. And of course, as you mentioned, we are dealing with a lot of division at this point in the world. We need to find that common ground. We need to come together, because that's actually what's in the service of humanity, and not the fighting each other.
Absolutely. There's enough of fighting and killing each other going on right now. We don't need to exacerbate it by having schisms over smaller issues, because those are just a microcosm of the bigger piece. So if we can mend the schisms on smaller issues, we have a chance of learning how to do it for the bigger ones.
Yeah, that's actually also related to power games, because if we give in to this division, which is also directed, as we know, then we let ourselves be used as puppets in a way. And we want to move out of that. I often say everything I do is in the service of freedom. We need to recognize that when we actually come together, we are working in the service of freedom, and not when we fight each other, right? So in my work, I also talk a lot about inner power, intrinsic, or power versus positional power, or power over others. And intrinsic power meaning the power to create, to bring about results, and to the power to inspire as well. And in a word, it's in a nutshell, it's really the power to generate all the good stuff. Yes, the results we want to see, versus that positional power that can sometimes serve the same purpose, but doesn't always do that. Right? So sometimes we can use our positional power for the good. Of course, why not? That's what it's for, really. But oftentimes we see it also abused, or just not used in the service of others. And as you said before, we sometimes see people in leadership positions only or mostly use that positional power to their own benefit. So let's discuss power games a little bit more. What power games have you seen in your work with your clients, or just observing power dynamics in organizations?
Oh yeah, juicy topic. So many power games going on. I'm doing research on that very topic for my next book, actually. And so far, I've got an open survey at the moment on what kinds of power games people are experiencing. And two of the most significant power games that people experience are credit stealing. So somebody stealing credit for the work or their work. And the second one is blame shifting. So blaming others for disasters. And I think that's really interesting. It's interesting because it shows how powerful the force of power is within an organization. What I'm mostly curious about, though, are what are the roots of that? Because these are weeds in our workplaces, and we need to pull them up by the roots. And for those two, blame shifting and credit stealing, this is all about positioning ourselves as worthy of accolades, of recognition, etc. And for me, that points to earlier stage of leadership maturity, where we are still trying to gain a sense of ego through position and status. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to desire positional status. In fact, all of us go through that. It's how we develop a healthy sense of ego. I have something to contribute. I get recognition from my peers. It reinforces a positive sense of self. Where it can go off track, though, is when people start getting desperate for it and will be manipulating the situation to pile on a little bit of I did that sort of thing, and don't give credit to their colleagues or take credit from their colleagues. And it becomes this sharp elbow rivalry type of thing. And So part of the roots of the problem are within the individual leadership maturity of those individuals playing those games. And yet the individuals also exist in an ecosystem of an organization, which means there are conditions, if we stay with the gardening metaphor, that allow those weeds to thrive. And if we change the systems of how we interact, how we report, how we discuss, how we recognize people, then there will be less of a need for people to have the sharp elbows and steal credit, etc., because everybody is clear and accountable, and things are transparent, and robust decision making. Transparent decision making eliminates all that kind of office politics and backroom positioning kind of activity. That's the aspiration that I have. So there's two elements there I think that we can address to try and reduce some of these toxic behaviors, is to restructure how we run our teams and our organizations for transparency. Two is to assist in the deliberate leadership development of our people so that we can go through these earlier stages of expert and achiever more rapidly in a safe way, so that people can get on with the business of dealing collaboratively, which is what I say is the future of leadership in difficult circumstances. So we need to kind of press fast forward in some cases through some of these experiences for folks. So that's a little bit of what I'm seeing. Then of course, there's the big kahunas where you have other types of power games like bullying, like gaslighting, like undermining, and those are pretty awful. And often it's the CEO who is suffering from those behaviors at the hands of their chair or board members. It's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. CEO is the sandwich, is the meat and sandwich between the board and the people that they lead, the executive and the rest of the organization. And they have to cop a lot. They have to be an umbrella to shield their team from the shenanigans that often happen at boards. And then they've got to front up and discuss and navigate the tensions and the rivalries that exist at board level, which can be quite perilous as well. You can have pretty toxic board environment as well, because people show up on boards not often for altruistic reasons, and quite often for very selfish reasons. So there's always these tensions to manage. And in unhealthy work processes and work environments, those kinds of toxic power games can take root and spread and become quite untenable.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of content there that I find extremely, extremely interesting and insightful. Thank you for sharing that. So, yes, credit stealing and blame shifting. This happens so much. It happens in meetings. It happens everywhere. And I sometimes think this victimhood, this victim mode is actually something that our society supports. And we need to move away from that a little bit more and really step into what I call a self-empowering mindset, or individually, yes, but also really help ourselves show up as the creative and powerful beings that we are, instead of having the need to put the blame on others, which doesn't really help us at all and helps nobody. So this is a very rich topic in itself, which we could do an entire show about, I believe. Especially in our current society, it's really, really something that is supported, and unfortunately so. So how do you see the power, or no, sorry, how do you see the future of power in leadership? What can you share about that? I know you shared part of it already, but what else comes to mind when you hear the future of power in leadership?
Two things. Future of leadership is collaborative, and therefore the future of power is collaborative. And in that, there is a desperate need for transparency. So the way that collaboration is going to work effectively is to have transparency embedded in all of our organizational practices. And in doing so, it's a great power check, because if there's no backroom decision making, because it's all transparent, it reduces the risk of abuse of power. It reduces the risks of power games actually being played out because everything is transparent. So that is sort of the dream of some of these collaborative organizations that are rising in the background, distributed organizations, DAOs they're called, distributed autonomous organizations, DAO, and they use the blockchain for that very reason, transparency, and all the transactions and decision making are there on the blockchain. They're immutable, they can't be changed, therefore are immune to, allegedly, to corruption. Though in the early days of DAOs, people have still worked out some ways to manipulate the system. And yet it is an example of how we can set up systems to create fail-safes against these abuses of power, which is why when we start to change the checks on power, let's say at nations, at national levels, we're seeing as the bid in the United States to put the president above the law in the execution of his powers, which is a very dangerous precedent. To give that much unchecked power to one individual or even to an executive office, I think is very, very dangerous. And it's only by making things extremely transparent with these multiple checks on power and having a collaborative approach to power that we'll be able to keep power at bay. And the other thing I want to pick up too, the future of power is, as you said, is helping people to learn to feel powerful. And when people feel powerful, that also gives them a little bit of courage to stand up to the stretchings of power, to power games, etc. The more powerful people feel, the less likely they will just to let power games pass them by and to speak up and do something about it, or to call somebody out on it, or to introduce a system to eliminate that kind of power dynamic. So getting people to learn how to feel and be powerful in their day-to-day life and work is an essential aspect of that. So there's a deeply personal development aspect to the future of power, as well as the collaborative nature of it that needs to be unfolded in transparent systems.
I agree. When you feel powerful, you don't have a need to exert power over others, because that is, well, when you feel positively powerful, to rephrase it, I believe that we often see this phenomenon, or to call it something, in certain situations where people are too obedient to authorities because they see an opportunity to all of a sudden show up as an authority themselves. And with that, to exert that power over others, that really doesn't correspond them. And when people feel intrinsically powerful, they do not have that need. That's what I believe. What do you say about that?
I'm not sure about that one, because I'm thinking about that. How do we get to feel powerful? One of it is self-generated, self-development, our own inner narrative, drawing on our own, like all that kind of inner resilience piece.
Yes.
Then you give somebody a piece of authority. I don't care who you are, it's energizing. And all the research shows that too. It's like, ooh, because it's a boost in esteem, it's a boost of privilege, it's a boost of status. We're all susceptible to that. And so that's the danger point. That's where the shadow of all our leadership archetypes come into play, is that energizing, brain changing biochemical processes that happens when we are given authority to execute orders over the top of other people, on behalf of other people. It can feel really amazing. And that's where things can go, that's the shadowy line can start to get executed. And that's where we can start to make decisions that benefit us, and it just starts with little, I don't think it's a sudden change. I think it's little creeping things where it's like, and the research shows it too, that very experienced leaders, when they first go into leadership roles, get given that authority, are very gracious and tempered in the execution of that role. In fact, they show Queen Elizabeth I as an example of that. She was in power for 40 years, I think, and she was always very careful to consult her advisors in the beginning as she was uncertain in her position. towards the end of her reign, she was snappy, dismissive, and just wanted to get things done. And I think this can happen to any one of us. We get so used to executing and having authority that we can abuse it a little bit. So I'm not so sure that feeling powerful within is a safe enough inoculation against the intoxicating effect of authority. And I would say it's not enough. It's not enough to keep us from the temptation.
Yeah, we need some other factors to complement it. Great point. Thanks for sharing that. Yes, absolutely. Of course, it's a very complex topic, and yes, the research does show a lot of very frightening things in that arena. Just, all those experiments where they tell people to do crazy things to other people and painful things, inflict pain on other people, and they do it so willingly. That is frightening for sure. Not just leaders, but just really anybody, right? So it is in human nature, unfortunately. And this is something we want to counteract with awareness, yes.
Oh my God, the deference to authority is such a powerful force. And it's an interesting one that's entrenched. So here's an example. Went skiing last weekend with my husband, and at the top of this lift, there's a big sign saying, the track to Gathaga is closed. And they just put up a little sign and you can just ski around it. And my husband and I looked at each other. We looked at the sign, we looked at each other, looked at the sign. And I'm like, should we do it? What if it's unsafe? Why do they block it off? We're going through all this, are we going to break the rules kind of thing? And so we didn't. We skied away, and then we came back to it, and we did that whole pontification again. Should we do it? Should we not? We did break the rules, and there were no repercussions. Luckily, we didn't get injured. The track was a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
But it's this deference to authority that makes us follow and be compliant. And that's an example of how we broke the rules, and there was nobody directing us not to. If somebody had stood there saying, no, you can't go, I don't think we would have gone, but it was left to us. If you have somebody standing over you with a uniform or symbols of authority, it's very difficult to say, no, I disagree. Whether, for example, it's a police officer, or as a lot of those studies have, a medical doctor in a lab coat signifying I'm an expert, I have authority. We want to follow the rules. We want to comply, and breaking them feels wrong in most cases. For some people, it's energizing.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's true actually too, because it is. So I've been in those situations myself, and in a way it's energizing, but it's also a big effort. It's not that nice to do, right? But I have fought corruption in many ways, in many different under many different circumstances, both as a business owner, in some countries, and also personally, especially also in the last 4 years. And it's not always very pleasant, even though it could be energizing. So that's also a very interesting phenomenon. But sometimes I think, and that's why ethics comes in again. As we said, ethics can be something different for different people, for sure. But if you are driven enough by your top values, and if you're really clear on them, sometimes you just have to do it. You have to stand up for what you think is right, which might not be the right thing in general, but there's this urge also, this inner urge. And I do feel that personally. It might not be everybody's thing. It's again, we have so many topics that we could go on forever in an entire episode, because you bring up many, many interesting things. I really appreciate that, Zoe.
Oh, you're welcome. In fact, yeah, there's the exercise of power in different circumstances is a very massive topic. And as we were talking about breaking the rules or standing up against authority, it reminded me of one of the books I've read in my research by Jeffrey Pfeffer called The 7 Rules of Power. And in that book, he sort of takes this Machiavellian approach to exercising or developing a sense of power. And one of the recommendations he has is break the rules, show yourself how powerful you are. And I read that, I went, no, surely not, no. And I was horrified by it. And the story he wrote about was one of his students showed up at an event. She didn't have an invitation to it. She pretended that she did. She brought an extra person and she bluffed her way through it. And the energizing part of this, which is how she felt powerful, is like, I broke the rules and got away with it. And so that I broke the rules and got away with it is an energizing, feeling powerful experience, which is problematic for lots of different reasons.
Yes.
Breaking the rules being one of them. And I think it's a complex issue when we talk about how do we speak truth to power. Well, where are we breaking the rules? Should we be breaking the rules? How do we stand up and speak truth to power? Should we, etc. And it's just navigating those seas of gray again. Sometimes it feels really clear, like that is wrong. I have to say something, even though it'll be a personal cost. And those are actually great examples because not easy to do, but they seem more clear cut than what am I doing in this background? Was it right of me to break the rules and to ski around the sign that says, don't go here? No, it probably wasn't a good thing to do because I could have been injured and that's why they blocked it off in the first place, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, lots to explore in this one.
Yes. What are some trends that are affecting leaders right now? What would you say?
Well, let's get the obvious ones out there. So obviously artificial intelligence is huge. Robotics, automation is really a big one. Alongside of that is the rise of the importance of ESG. So environmentalism, social and governance reporting and transparency. That hasn't really gone away, even though it seems to be less in the news lately. The importance of being a good corporate citizen has never gone away. And though not everybody's being held to account with that. Some other trends, the importance of mental health and the stewardship of leaders to manage their people holistically is a pretty big one as well. Blockchain, I think, is a big sleeper. It hasn't yet delivered on all of its promises to underpin new currencies and new technologies and new decision making. That is all ripe for the taking. I think that's an opportunity. Opportunities are there for organizations to embrace that technology and integrate it into their systems for greater transparency and collaboration down the track. So those are a couple of the big ones, I think, that leaders need to keep in mind as they're navigating the future. But really, at the moment, what's burning on people's mind is cost of living and cost of doing business. It's what's tempering in the short term people's abilities to think long term. And I think we need to get beyond that, or not get beyond it. It's a tension to manage. It's a polarity that we always need to manage, like the burning platforms of now and the future horizons. And leaders need to get better at managing those tensions, that polarity. I think we spend too much time and effort on the burning platforms and not enough on the horizon thinking. So that's a little bit of a summary of what I think is going on for leaders right now.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. Very rich. Very rich. Lots going on. So yes, we are sort of getting to the end of our time here today. I really appreciate everything that you have been sharing with us. It's been extremely insightful, and we have covered a lot of different aspects. Now, where can people find you online, Zoë?
They can come to my planet at zoerouth.com. That's where the central hub of all of my activity is. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can find me there. I have my own leadership podcast called the Zoë Routh Leadership Podcast, to be rebranded and launched as Fit for the Future Leadership in September. So those are the few of the places you can listen to me, read me, engage with me, imagine the future with me.
That's great. And where can we find your books?
They are all on all the digital platforms, so all the retailers, or you can get a signed copy from my own website, zoerouth.com.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. Any last words of wisdom that you would like to share, something that I didn't ask you about or something that we just couldn't talk about yet and that's super important on your mind?
I think when it comes to feeling powerful, one of the things I recommend people do is do hard things. And so you start to build the capacity to embrace the suck and do difficult things. And it could be physical things. And one of the simple ways to do hard things is to do things like have a cold shower in the morning, or at least have a cold rinse after your shower. It's a way of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the ability to be comfortable with being uncomfortable will help build our resilience, our ability to stay on an even keel, even though the world is topsy-turvy. So do hard things is my first recommendation. My second recommendation is read more books. Readers are leaders, leaders are readers. And the more that we read, whether it's listening to audiobooks or reading an actual book, we expand our perspective, and perspective is power. So when you read more, you can lead better. That's what I recommend.
Absolutely. Reading is like traveling. It expands our horizons, as you said.
Absolutely.
And in fact, in the past, I read a lot of historic fiction books. So a combination of historic and fiction about other countries that I've never traveled to. And I learned so much about those countries.
Yeah.
It's really, really amazing. Okay. Thank you so much, Zoe, for being on with us today. And thank you for all the listeners for being on with us. Zoe, thank you for enlightening us with your leadership insights and your visions. And I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Regina. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Rise to Lead. Keep shining your light, standing up for what's right, and inspiring others to step into their brilliance. If you like this episode, please give it a 5-star rating and subscribe to the Rise to Lead podcast on your preferred podcast app. Until next time, it's Regina Huber, and in the meantime, remember to rise to lead.